My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here, and I organise the English speaking events that we have here, both in person and on Zoom. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces as well. And we're delighted to be partnering once again with Camera, who do such incredible work and increasingly, unfortunately, increasingly important work. So we're going to be talking about a topic which has been in the news, of course, since October 7th. The whole question of anti-Semitism, rising anti-Semitism around the world, has been something we've all been all too aware of, and in the last couple of weeks, tragically aware of, because of events in the United States, in Washington, and also in Boulder, Colorado. And I think in a different way, or a related way, education has also, of course, been very prominent, because we're all very familiar with what's been happening on university campuses in the US and the UK and really across the West in the wake of October 7th. We're here this evening to hear, you'll be hearing about a really important and useful and disturbing but important report that Ricky Hollander from Camera has produced, but also work from Emmanuel Conan and Impact, represented here by Dan Koski, who are all in their different ways informing us and educating us about just how this whole question of education and the way that it has been sort of infiltrated, perverted in certain ways by various actors, and why that is so important today in the wake of October 7th, and how it's impacting the West and the Middle East, and also how those two are connected. So I'm going to hand over to my co-host for the evening, Aviva Rosenshine. Before I do that, let me just say that you'll hear, after the initial presentations, you'll hear a panel discussion. In the envelopes on your seats, or maybe under your seats at this point, I don't know, you're either sitting on them or they're on your seats, is a card, there's a donation card for Camera, which you're of course encouraged to give generously to, but also a card with which to write questions on. So as a question occurs to you, write the question on. I'm going to be standing just around here, so you can signal to me. I'll take the question, and once I collect all the questions, I'm going to select some of those to give to our Aviva to put to our guests. Okay. Aviva Rosenshine is the Director of External Affairs for Camera in Israel. For her first 15 years, she was the Director of the International Campus Department, where she oversaw the efforts of Camera's campus department across North America, the UK and Israel. She has a deep understanding of the bias against Israel spread across university settings and the necessity to strengthen the education of Jewish and non-Jewish children in Israel and Jewish indigeneity to the land. She's a graduate of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, majoring in journalism and Judaic studies, originally from Boston. She made Aliyah in 2013 and lives in Pardes Hana Karkur with a husband and 2 children. Aviva Rosenshine, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. We appreciate the Begin Center collaboration with Camera and bringing this vital discussion to the forefront, and we look forward to ongoing cooperation in the future. I'd also like to take a moment to thank my colleagues, Elise Fisher, Ham Yochai, and Shachar Gufi, who helped make this event possible. Thank you all for being here tonight for a critical and timely conversation, one that sits at the intersection of education, media, and the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias in our societies. Camera has been monitoring the media since 1992, and that work remains central to our mission. We tracked how false and biased reporting, whether in US, UK, Spain, Israel, or Arabic language media tied to Western media outlets like the BBC, shapes not just public opinion, but the messaging of influencers, activists, educators, and government officials. We've seen how quickly misinformation spreads and takes hold, Just in recent days, false claims that Israel targeted civilians trying to access humanitarian aid were picked up widely, only later to be disproven, including by the aid organizations on the ground. Or the dramatic false claim that 14,000 babies in Gaza were at risk of dying, a figure repeated globally, then quietly retracted by some, while other outlets left to legitimize this hoax by failing to correct. These falsehoods are driving hate and violence across the world. But media is just one front. Since the 90s, camera has worked intensively in the education sphere because we know that what begins in the classroom can ripple into society for generations. From biased campus lectures to anti-Israel indoctrination and elementary school textbooks, the messaging is clear and it is dangerous. I spent 15 years working with university students to combat anti-Israel bias and anti-Semitism across campuses in the US, the UK, and in Israel. I watched as chants like Zionism is white supremacy, long live the Intifada, went from radical to routine, fueling the kind of hostility and exclusion that has now turned, in some cases, to deadly violence. And we now know this indoctrination begins far earlier than in college. In UNRWA and Palestinian Authority schools, incitement against Israel and Jews is woven into the curriculum. Martyrdom is celebrated, Israel is erased, and these messages have traveled across borders into Western classrooms and curricula. That's why we are here tonight, to expose what is happening, to understand how it's spreading, and to ask the hardest question, what can we do to stop it? We are joined by a panel of experts who have been confronting this challenge from multiple angles, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce them. We'll hear first from Dan Koski. Dan is Director of Global Strategy and Communications at Impact SE. He routinely briefs government ministers, parliamentarians, and other decision makers on textbook reform. Prior to Impact SE, Dan headed international agencies helping governments, politicians, NGOs, issue groups and businesses achieve strategic targets and amplify their cause. Dan has managed successful national and international campaigns, significantly raising public awareness on a variety of issues. He has regularly worked alongside global figures, leaders in the corporate and charitable sectors, and his opinion articles have been published globally, including bylines in The Guardian in the UK, Washington Times, The Australian, and EU Observer, and he's also been interviewed widely, including on the BBC and Al Jazeera. After Dan, we'll hear from Dr. Emmanuel Navon. Dr. Emmanuel Navon is an international relations scholar and author. He lectures international relations at Tel Aviv University. He was awarded the Best Professor of the Year by the Faculty of Social Sciences in 22. He is a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and a foreign affairs analyst for I-24 News. He also taught at Reichman University and at the IDF's National Security College. Dr. Navon has authored 4 books and dozens of articles that have appeared in prestigious journals such as the Review of International Studies, the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs, and world-class newspapers such as Le Monde and Newsweek. His book, The Star and the Scepter, A Diplomatic History of Israel, is an academic reference which has been translated so far to Hebrew, Chinese, Japanese, French, and Italian. And then we'll hear from Ricky Hollander. Ricky is a senior media analyst at Camera. Her analyses and commentary and letters about the Arab-Israeli conflict, its media coverage, and education issues have appeared in such publications as the National Review, Middle East Quarterly, Newsweek, New York Post, Spectator, Chicago Sun-Times, Allgemeiner, and the Times of Israel. She has lectured across North America and in Israel about the topic. And Ricky is also a co-author of the monograph Indicting Israel, New York Times coverage of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Her work with Camera's Education Institute includes curriculum analysis. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dan Koski up to the podium.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me, Aviva, Paul, to give some comments on this really critical issue that's facing us all, I think, today. Before I dive in, just want to give you a couple of words about our organisation, Impact SE, the Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education, so much more easily referred to as Impact SE. We are a research and policy institute, and we research one thing really and one thing only, and that is national school curricula, textbooks. Our research teams look at textbooks, they analyse them page by page, line by line, produce in-depth reports with real policy recommendations on how these textbooks should change. And crucially, we then go and share those reports with the governments in question, and we work with the governments themselves to try and deliver real change, to try and make textbooks across the world less hateful, more tolerant, more respectful. It's important to add, though, that we don't sort of do this in a vacuum. All of our research is benchmarked against international standards that are mainly derived from documents from UNESCO, from other international bodies, and they're pretty, I think, incontrovertible standards. We believe that textbooks should respect the other. We believe that textbooks should not include hate, they should not include incitement, they should encourage peacemaking, they should encourage gender equality, things that I hope at least are universal standards. As such, our research spans a huge geographical area. We have research countries, textbooks in countries in Africa, in Asia, large parts of Europe. But I'd say the core of our work, or the big focus of our work really, is the Middle East and North Africa. And as such, we have been for decades now looking very closely at the Palestinian curriculum, and that's really going to be the focus of what I say in the next few minutes. But I think before we dive into that, it's important really to have some understanding as to who runs the schools, who runs Palestinian schools. So until October 7th in Gaza, schools were run either by Hamas or by UNRWA. And in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, schools are run by either UNRWA or the Palestinian Authority, the PA. But what's really, I think, important to understand is that whether Palestinian schools are run by Hamas, by UNRWA or by the PA, at the core of each and every one of them is the Palestinian Authority curriculum. That really is the core text, the corpus of textbooks in the PA curriculum lies at the heart of every Palestinian school. And it's worth reflecting that although Hamas has been in power in Gaza for 17, 18 years, they've had ample opportunity to develop their own curriculum, but they clearly have decided not to. They use the PA curriculum, which I think gives you a real indication as to quite how worrying and quite how dangerous really the PA curriculum actually is. I'm going to give you a few examples, I think, to illustrate the trends that we see within the PA curriculum. Unfortunately, the PA curriculum contains an amount of I guess, classic anti-Semitism, and this is just one example here. This is from a grade 10 geography and history textbook, and it basically argues that Israel was only created simply because Jews control the world. Jews control the economy, Jews control politics, Jews control the media, and therefore Israel was created. PA textbooks also are, they encourage martyrdom. It's as simple as that. This is an example from grade 5 Arabic language textbook. And this particular passage says that basically it is preferable, as it says here quite poetically, to drink the cup of bitterness, i.e. of death, than it is to live a long and pleasant life. In other words, Palestinian children here are being encouraged to choose death over life. And of course, who is the target of their martyrdom? The target of their martyrdom is Jews and is Israelis. This example is a grade 6 teacher guide. A teacher guide is what the PA say should really be the bottom line of each and every lesson. And the bottom line of this lesson is that the Zionists are terrorists and the Zionists should disappear. There's plenty of glorification of violence as well. This example here, grade 8 Arabic language, you can see it's a pretty graphic text. It's a reading comprehension that talks about cutting the necks of the enemies, i.e. of Israeli soldiers in this case. An example here of justification of the Munich Olympic massacre. And I think these two examples really some of the hardest hitting. This is grade 4 mathematics. And while the rest of the world teaches these very young children addition through adding apples or adding oranges, this question here asks Palestinian children to add the number of martyrs from the first Intifada to the number of martyrs from the second Intifada. And as you can see, it's accompanied by a picture of coffins being raised above a crowd at a funeral. Similarly, Newton's laws of physics are taught through the example of a young girl using a slingshot to hurl a rock. And I think you have to try and understand the mentality here, and this is within Palestinian textbooks, trying to think of content that encourages violence, that encourages martyrdom, and trying to make it fit into science and into maths. It's quite mental gymnastics, but clearly this is it's reflective of how deep I think the problem really is. Now, I mentioned UNRWA at the beginning. As I said, UNRWA uses Palestinian textbooks. Here's another pretty striking example. This is an Arabic language textbook from the PA curriculum, which asks students to study the life of the terrorist Dalal Mughrabi, who in the late 1970s murdered over 30 Israelis on a bus in northern Israel, including 13 children. In this passage, basically, she is lauded as the ideal, as the Palestinian female role model. And the picture on the right shows it on a blackboard here in an UNRWA classroom. This is what is being taught in UNRWA classrooms. UNRWA also uses its own self-created materials on top of the PA curriculum. This one here describes a firebombing attack on an Israeli bus as mockingly as a barbecue party. And finally, this is an UNRWA exam, grade 5. The question is, it's a true or false question, and the question is, liberating the Al-Aqsa Mosque, making sacrifices for it is an obligation for Muslims, true or false? Obviously the answer is true. Taking a step back, I think it's worth pointing out at least just a handful of examples. We have documented hundreds upon hundreds of examples through the PA curriculum which are problematic and which are hateful. And we're under no illusions that the PA has no intention of changing the curriculum. Back in 2020, the former PA Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh went as far as saying publicly that if the international community were to withhold funding because of their textbooks, that he would rather take money away from the budgets for water and for electricity. It has become an article of faith for the PA leadership to retain this content in its schools. But I think that means also that the onus is not just on the PA, the onus is on those who are funding the PA, in other words, the international community. Western governments are bankrolling the PA, they continue to bankroll the PA, and our very clear message when we meet Western governments, which we do regularly, is that if you're going to give money to the Palestinian Authority, it must be conditioned upon textbook reform. This needs to change, and we are starting to see some chinks of light. The European Union, within the last year, actually signed an agreement with the PA which stipulated that the next tranche of money from Brussels to Ramallah will be conditioned on reforms, including textbook reform. We're obviously following that very closely. We hope it actually bears some fruit. But I think we also have an opportunity today, when the world is talking about the day after in Gaza. What will society look like on the day after? There's an opportunity here. If there is going to be some kind of sea change in Gaza or beyond, then it has to include textbook reform. I'd like to actually finish though on a positive. Having detailed the deep problems in Palestinian textbooks, because it's crucial, I think, to place Palestinian education within the regional context, because Palestinian education is something of an outlier. In the last 7, 8, 9 years, we have seen some really positive changes in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, in Morocco, in Egypt and beyond. We have seen curricula shift from being curricula that encouraged hate, that encouraged anti-Semitism, that encourage intolerance and violence, to curricula that now embrace the other, that embrace other religions and embraces peace with Israel. I won't spend too long on it, but the United Arab Emirates now, includes, it encourages peace with Israel. In Saudi Arabia, where post 9/11 there was such a focus on the extremist education, content has been removed. They used to teach the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Today they teach peace with Jews, peace with Christians, peace with non-Muslims. Morocco entirely embraces diversity. They teach that minorities are key to the fabric of Moroccan society. This example here, I think, is a lovely example. It's grade 4 Arabic language, and it shows a Jewish boy hosting a Muslim friend for Shabbat dinner. We have another example from the Moroccan curriculum here of students learning about the Jewish Museum in Morocco, learning about the importance of Jewish heritage to Morocco. And in Egypt, we're also seeing year on year reforms that are doing similar things, removing problematic content and teaching that peace with Israel is admirable and is to be applauded. So my concluding message is really simple. There is an urgent and dire need for change in Palestinian education. If it doesn't change, we know exactly kind of where it's going to lead. But that is not a pipe dream. that is eminently possible, and it's shown by our neighbours here in the region. It's shown by the Emiratis, it's shown by the Saudis, the Moroccans, etc. In other words, if we want it to happen, it can happen. And I think really the only thing standing in the way of a similar process is the willingness to do so. I'm going to leave it there for now and invite Dr. Emmanuel Navon.
Thank you. Good evening. I think it was a very interesting presentation, and I agree with you that there are some important changes in the UAE and in Morocco. And sometimes I think one of the paradoxes you see today is that you see more changes sometimes in the Arab world than in Europe. I'm going to speak a little bit about Europe.
Can you talk louder?
Yes, even though education or the curriculum in European schools is not exactly my domain of expertise. I'm a professor in international relations, but I think that Camera does such an important work that I happily accepted the invitation and come talk about it. And as I was saying, very often today you see actually more positive changes towards Jews in certain Arab countries than in Europe itself. When in Europe, you have this very radicalized second and third generation of migrants, whose grandparents, it's very clear to them when you look at countries like France or the UK, I'm going to be talking about France and the UK, but look also at countries like Belgium or Sweden. And you see those 20-year-something youngsters that are very radicalized, much more than the parents and grandparents. You see this Muslim headscarf that has become commonplace among Muslim women in most European countries, but their grandmothers in North Africa did not wear it. And you see this indoctrination and this hatred. I mean, as we're talking, it's really tragic. I did my, my weekly Asbah short movie today. I was warning 4 soldiers who died unfortunately on Friday, young men in their early 20s, and contrasting this with those 20-something morons coming from Europe, such as Greta Thunberg, she's 22, to liberate Palestine, right? So those 4 youngsters, they gave their life for our freedom. And then you have those European Islamized radicals supposedly bringing freedom to Palestine. Now, I'm like, where in the Arab world is there freedom, for goodness sake? This Palestine, so-called Palestine, if Israel didn't exist, this so-called Palestine would be an autocratic failed state, and it would be as free as our neighbors such as Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, or Libya, right? So you see the impact of education in those countries, right? This complete ignorance. People have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. And so let's look at it. As I said, I'm going to be talking very briefly about France and the UK. There are many countries in Europe, and we only have by now 7 minutes. But the point is that teaching this hatred of Jews in Europe is actually part of a strategy. There was recently a report that was submitted to the French government and recently leaked to the newspaper Le Figaro. And that report that was submitted to the Interior Minister shows how political Islam in general and the Muslim Brotherhood in particular are implementing a well-planned strategy for the Islamization of France and of Europe. Now, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's a 73-page report written by the French government, okay, by French high civil servants and officials that describe very precisely how the Muslim Brotherhood has been planning and taking over France by the quiet jihad and the rest of Europe. Okay. Now, this Islamization has been seen and felt in schools for years. In matter of fact, and I show it here in this picture on the slide, it first came to public attention in France in 1989 when a young Muslim girl showed up in a public elementary school with a headscarf or hijab. And the French government at the time didn't know how to react to that. Like, what do? You know, the French are very, they used to be actually very serious about the secularism. And you know, when you become an immigrant in France, well, it used to be the case at least, you leave your religion at home and not in the school. So eventually the government decided to outlaw those headscarves, but it progressively lost control of its educational system. Now, this trend was documented in a book published in 2002 under the title Les Territoires Perdus de la République, the Republic's Lost Territories. And the book compiles anonymous testimonies from teachers working in suburbs. It shows a growing rejection of the French Republic's core values such as secularism, gender equality, and freedom of expression in French public schools. The book also reveals worrying trends when it comes to anti-Semitism. For example, teachers report widespread anti-Semitic remarks, denial of the Holocaust, and harassment of Jewish students and teachers. And then, of course, there is the harassment and even the murder of teachers accused of blasphemy just for talking about Islam and the Prophet. In 2006, for example, Robert Redeker, a philosophy teacher, faced death threats after publishing an opinion piece in Le Figaro where he criticized Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. In response to the threats, which including his personal information being shared online, Redeker was placed under police protection and went into hiding. In 2020, Samuel Paty, a 47-year-old history and civics teacher, was murdered after having shown his students caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad during a class on freedom of expression. And following an online campaign against him, he was beheaded by an 18-year-old Muslim from Chechnya. And then more recently in 2023, Dominique Bernard, a literature teacher, was stabbed to death by a former student of his in the school who shouted Allah Akbar. Now, many French teachers in elementary schools have been reporting that teaching the Holocaust has become impossible in classes with Muslim students. For example, in 2010, a history teacher in the city of Nancy, Catherine Pedersoli, was suspended for dedicating significant class time to Holocaust education and for organizing trips to former concentration camps. An inspection report criticized her for lacking neutrality and accused her of brainwashing students. Now, there's no anti-Semitic content in the curriculum of French school, but there's a growing anti-Semitism in French public schools. And this anti-Semitism comes mostly from Muslim students who won't let teachers talk about the Holocaust and who threaten and even kill them when they talk about Islam. In the UK, on the other hand, there is explicitly anti-Semitic material in Islamic elementary schools. I'll give you 4 short examples. In 2010, the BBC revealed that 40 Islamic schools in the UK were using textbooks from the Saudi national curriculum before they were changed. These materials, including assertions that Jews were transformed into monkeys and pigs, exercises asking children to list the reprehensible qualities of Jews, claims that Zionists aim to control the world and incite conflict among major powers, teachings that non-Muslims face hellfire after death, and instructions on corporal punishments such as amputations for theft. In 2011, Channel 4 revealed that teachers at the Darul Uloom School in Birmingham made derogatory remarks about non-Muslims, including Jews and Hindus, and advocated for violent punishments under Sharia law. In 2016, the Department of Education investigated the Islamic Tarbiyah Academy in Dewsbury after it was found distributing leaflets of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a notorious anti-Semitic forgery alleging of a Jewish conspiracy for world domination. Other materials condemned Western culture and promoted isolation from British society. In 2025, very recently this year, reports emerged about a teacher at the Jafariya school in Tooting expressing support for Hezbollah and pledging to raise children as soldiers of the Imam. The school displayed imagery of Iranian leaders and disseminated content glorifying martyrdom. Now, these are, and I'll finish now, these are examples from Muslim schools, not from public ones, but the tendency is clear, and it is similar in other European countries with large Muslim populations, such as Belgium and Sweden. And you see on this map the concentration of Muslim population from gray to green and dark green. And now, and that's my last point, what can we do? I would say that European societies are at a cross point. They can either submit to Islam, and Islam needs submission, which is also, by the way, the title of this famous book from Michel Houellebecq, or they can fight back and impose full cultural integration on migrants. It's no coincidence that Europeans who want to preserve their Judeo-Christian civilization support Israel. They understand that we face a common enemy, and I think that Israel must understand that it has allies among Europeans who refuse to capitulate to this enemy. So I'll end here. Thank you for your attention. Oh, sorry, can I have to call the next speaker? No?
Ricky.
Ricky, sorry.
So we've heard from Dan and Emmanuel how Palestinian and Islamist.
Could you speak into the mic more, please?
Could you hear me now?
Closer, make it closer.
Okay. So we've heard about the Islamist and Palestinian entrance into Palestinian education and European education. I'm going to talk about how some of these same forces have entered, the same ideology has entered American schools, U.S. schools. Since the 1980s, Hamas has been spreading its tentacles into the U.S.
It's really hard for us to hear back here. Can
Okay.
you speak into the mic, please?
So since the 1980s, Hamas has been spreading its tentacles into the U.S. with networks for fundraising, education, and spreading anti-Zionist propaganda. And not just Hamas, anti-Israel BDS networks with ties to PFLP and other terrorist groups have become even more active since October 7th. And their growth and success is a result of a so-called Red-Green Alliance. The Palestinians and Islamists, the Greens, the so-called Greens, have aligned themselves with far-left Marxist and socialist groups, the so-called Reds. And we've just seen the horrific consequences, the double murders of young Israeli embassy staff in DC by an anti-Semitic terrorist tied to far-left organizations, and the terrorist attack by an Islamist in Boulder, Colorado. And it's this Red-Green Alliance, which long predated October 7th, that has enabled anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic propaganda to be pushed into U.S. public schools by activist teachers and teachers' unions in school curricula, literature, and recommended resources. And this comes under the guise of social justice and Marxist thinking. And it has polluted the K-12 arena with a biased ideology that views Israel, that presents Israel as a secular colonial state, Zionism as a European colonial movement, and Palestinians as the indigenous people of the land who are victimized by foreign Jewish implants. Now, since its inception in 2021, Camera's education has focused on exposing and combating the spread of these lies and the misinformation in schools that are entering U.S. public schools. So I want to bring as an example the Middle East component of the Choices curriculum, which is a social science curriculum for high schools that has until just recently been hosted by Brown University. Now, according to the program's website, its resources are used by 1 million students across the U.S., as well as it's also being used in 200 international schools. Now, of course, we don't know exactly which specific resources. This is probably a sum total of all the units and resources that are used. And there are 41 curriculum units. Only a few of them, they're on topics such as history, geography, current affairs, and only a few address directly or indirectly Zionism, Israel, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. But given that this curriculum was under the auspices of a prestigious Ivy League university, and that it includes a unit on questions for U.S. policy regarding the Middle East, we decided to do a thorough investigation of the relevant materials. And we also investigated the Brown University Center for Middle East Studies and the toxic and extremist anti-Israel ideology that's promoted and disseminated from there. So the Choices Curriculum's Middle East component is informed and influenced by that Middle East Center, which according to its mission statement is the hub for Middle East studies at Brown. So I want to look at that Center for Middle East Studies. The founding director of the center, which was established in 2012, is Bashara Dumani, a radical ideologue who also served as president of Birzeit for 2 years, in 2021 to 23, during the period where Hamas ideology flourished. And his declared goal at Brown is to shape the agenda of knowledge production on Palestine and Palestinians. He's brought in activist speakers and activist scholars who portrayed Jews as settler colonialists who took over native Palestinian land and who dismissed the concept of a Jewish homeland, Jewish history, and a Jewish people as myth and legend. And they portray efforts to combat anti-Semitism as part of a Jewish colonial conspiracy to delegitimize Palestinian resistance, which is their preferred term for terrorism. Some visiting professors have used Nazi terms to describe Zionism. One declared that it adopted the logic of that Zionism adopts the logic of an ethnic, racial, pure state. Another referred to Jewish Kristallnacht mobs thirsty for Palestinian blood. And many of the contributors to the curriculum, to this Choices curriculum, to the Middle East component, are or were affiliated with this Center for Middle East Studies. So we launched our investigation of the curriculum well before October 7th. We carefully researched the most recent version of the related content, which came out in 2022. We watched hours of videos to analyze all those that addressed Israel and Zionism and that are embedded in the digital version of the curriculum. And we read all the curricular texts, assignments, etc. related to the topic. There were no textbooks that were associated with this curriculum. And what we found and published about revealed the extent of a biased anti-Israel agenda that has paved the way for the explosion of extreme anti-Semitism that we've seen in schools, especially since October 7th. Both the readings, the curriculum's readings and videos overwhelmingly offer the same type of anti-Zionist narrative that's promoted by Dumani and his colleagues. They present Zionism as a foreign movement, founded by a foreign group of Jews who pushed for Jewish settlement despite only a tenuous connection to the land, an ancient history. The eternal Jewish connection to the land of Israel is downplayed, and the central role of Israel and Zion in Jewish culture, religion, and history is erased. Instead, students are taught that Zionists were allowed to dispossess the indigenous Palestinians because of prevailing sympathy for Jews following the Holocaust, and that Zionist Jews rejected coexistence with native Palestinians because they pushed for Jewish supremacy and continued to seize more and more Palestinian land for their colonial enterprise. The curriculum's equally disturbing historical revisionism erases Arab rejectionism, aggression, and terrorism. Terrorist groups are called resistance groups, and the only references to deadly and brutal terror attacks are sanitized and justified as armed struggle against Israeli occupation. So I just want to give you show you a few very, very short clips, abbreviated clips, to give you a flavor of what they're teaching. And this, it's perhaps not as crude as what Dan has shown, but so first we see Rima Hamami. She's an anthropology professor at Birzeit University. You can see. Just want to make that. Okay, thanks. Okay, she's she's a professor at Birzeit, but she was also affiliated with the Brown's Center for Middle East Studies. So, oops. Now, how do I? Let me go back to this. I'll just play it here. I'll play it here. Okay.
The Zionist movement, who represented the vast majority of Jewish people at that time, wanted that home to be in biblical Israel, which was Palestine. So we have this problem. We have one group of people saying this is our biblical homeland, and another group of people who were living there saying that this is where we live and where we've been living for thousands of years. But due to the circumstances of the time and the understandable sympathy with the Jewish people, the UN decided to, what they call partition, to split the land and say, okay, these parts are going to be the Jewish homeland, they're going to be called Israel, and these parts are going to be for the Palestinians. And they said very clearly that the parts that are going to be the Jewish homeland, the indigenous people, the Palestinians who are living there, should have the right to stay. What you have now is that within Israel, which is much more powerful, from 1967, they took those last Palestinian territories that were left in 1948, which is Gaza and the West Bank, and then continue to keep building and trying to take more of Palestinian land.
So you see, it's not as crude as what we saw in the Palestinian curriculum, but here she erases Jewish history in the land post-Bible. There's no centrality of Israel to Judaism, no rejection by Arab leaders of peace with Israel, no Arab wars of aggression or campaigns of terror to rid the region of a Jewish state, just Palestinians as the indigenous people and Jews as the settler colonialists. Now this one is Srimati Mitter, professor of Middle Eastern History and Public Affairs, also affiliated with Brown's Center for Middle East Studies.
Imagine if it's hundreds and thousands of people coming in, refugees, escaping, certain death in Europe, but they come and they take your land, they take your livelihood, they throw you out of your country, and then they say, well, actually this is ours because it was given to us in the Bible.
So these propagandists, because that's what they are, they've learned to use sympathy for Holocaust victims and survivors as their inoculation against charges of anti-Semitism. So instead, Mitter portrays, and the others portray, the problem of Jewish refugees not as having them take refuge in Israel, but of selfishly pushing out the native Palestinians from their land and depriving them of their livelihoods and freedoms. And finally, I want to show you the last one. It's Adi Ophir, an anti-Zionist Israeli who, on the fringes of society, whose academic career is dedicated to delegitimizing the Jewish state. As a visiting professor associated with the Center for Middle East Studies, Ophir provides a Jewish Israeli fig leaf for the center, although he actually spouts the most toxic anti-Semitic views. In fact, he's the professor I mentioned earlier who talked about Jewish Kristallnacht mobs thirsty for Palestinian blood. And his point is to portray Israel as a racist and apartheid state. He actually even announced, not in this video, but he has announced that he prays for the end of Jewish supremacy in Palestine.
There are two basic developments. One is the realization in the West that Israel has become an apartheid state.
So what have we done? We shared our findings with concerned parents in different school districts and with school committee members, as well as with the board and president of Brown University and the heads of Choices University. We also shared our analysis with various government committees and task forces investigating anti-Semitism in American schools. And this includes sharing follow-up reports about the university's Middle East Center, detailing how the university radicalized students even further after October 7th. So just to give you the update of what's happened, at the beginning of April, it was announced that the U.S. government planned to freeze $510 million of federal funding to Brown University because of anti-Semitism. And the university itself didn't acknowledge bias of its curricular materials regarding the Middle East, but it did end its sponsorship of the Choices curriculum, citing financial and staffing challenges, and noting that the outlook for future curriculum sales was weaker than in prior years. So this just goes to show how important it is to continue to research, expose, and publicize the toxic lies that are being promoted in schools, and to push back against them.
Thank you, Ricky, Dan, and Emmanuel. I'd like to invite you all to come up to the front so we can begin our discussion. I'm going to ask the panelists 1 or 2 questions based on time, and then I'll take questions from the audience. So if you have a card ready, this is a good time to raise your hand and let Paul know.
Yeah, this is a good idea. If you have questions, maybe pass them down the road so we know.
Hello, is it on?
Pass.
Okay, so we heard about some of the more extreme effects, impacts of this anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic narrative that we're seeing stemming from the Middle East all through the West, murders of teachers, of embassy officials, community members. But what are the more maybe subtle long-term effects that we might see from these anti-Israeli narratives that are normalized in the schools? What evidence do we have that they're actually influencing the general community of students? And this is for anyone who wants to answer.
I would just say that what we've been seeing for the past months, the murder of Jews, first of all, this couple, the embassy staff in Washington, this horrible murder, then there was the attack in Boston last weekend, and yesterday, 2 days ago, the attack of a rabbi in France. And so what we're witnessing is this violence against Jews is being justified and legitimized by this hatred, because the way anti-Semitism works is that anti-Semites, it's like a circular logic. They demonize the Jews as and the Jews and their state, because for them it's the same thing, the Jews, the Israelis. So if the Israelis in Israel, the Jews do all those horrible things, in the past it was controlling the world with a sacred cabal, and then using the blood of Christians' children to make matzah, and today is perpetrating genocide. So if those people are so horrible, the world is a better place without them. And therefore, first they demonize the Jews, and then they kill them to make the world a better place based on the lies that they've spread themselves about the Jews. So the effect is that you see this violence against Jews, where today, more and more, the Jews are the target of violence and murder around the world as a result of this defamation and demonization of Israel.
Just to build on what Emmanuel said, I think in the context of Palestinian textbooks, it's even clearer. To put simply, what's the impact of this kind of education in schools? It's October the 7th. If you teach a generation of children that Jews are evil, if you teach a generation of children that Israel has no right to be here, that it's going to be destroyed, if you teach a generation of children that they should be martyrs, if you teach a generation of children that they should cut the necks of the enemy, which I showed in one example, don't be surprised when they cut the necks of the enemy. Consider October the 7th, 5,000-6,000 Gazans perpetrated October the 7th. All of them went through the school system. So, it can't be a coincidence, it can't be just by chance. This is the result of a generation, possibly more, of violent indoctrination. Certainly in the Palestinian context, I think it's crystal clear.
Okay, I don't know if you can hear. You can just see on American college campuses the results of this indoctrination, the students who have been primed to think in terms of social justice, where they're taught that social justice means that in terms of oppressed and oppressor, where the Palestinians are the oppressed and Jews are the oppressors. And that's why you see on college campuses they defended, they justified October 7th, and you can see the same students who have been educated to think in terms of this and to see Jews as the oppressors, to see they reverse. It's a sort of a Holocaust inversion, where they now see the Jews as the new Nazis and the Palestinians as the Jews. And this has been what they've been taught in schools. They've been primed.
Thank you. I have a feeling a lot of people are going to ask about this next question. What can we do to remove it? I know you mentioned, Dan, for instance, you mentioned examples of Saudi Arabia, Morocco, even Egypt, that the curriculum has been bettered. We spoke a little bit, Ricky, about the choices curriculum. So what are the actual steps? How is this happening? How have any of the anti-Semitic material being removed? What can be done? Is there any hope for the Palestinians?
In the U.S. schools, so public schools are largely in the hands of the states and local districts. So the way to remove it is to go to school committee members, to go to the people in charge of the curriculum, the directors of social studies, the superintendents of schools, and present the case. You have to define exactly what the problem is and show how this is actually a violation of the civil rights of Jewish children who are made to feel uncomfortable in schools. But you have to be very specific and show exactly where and how. Either it's misinformation and it's a violation, and we've had some success there. We've had success with, for example, in one school district, a school committee member managed to introduce and pass a resolution to block anti-Semitic materials that was being pushed by the Teachers Association. And he went into detail about what the problems were, how it was misinformation, how it was anti-Semitism, and the resolution was passed by other school committee members. Similarly, in another district in Virginia, school textbooks were being reviewed, and they put some of them online to see which ones should be used and not. And we took screenshots of the various textbooks, analyzed them, looked at them, and recommended against 3 textbooks explaining specifically what the problems were and why they should be used, and they were eliminated from the curriculum.
I think the simple answer, and you asked particularly about Palestinian textbooks, it's a matter of political will. It's as simple as that. It's just a matter of political will. And as I said before, we know that the PA has no intention of changing, and therefore it falls on the international community to, not just twist their arm, but very strongly twist their arm and use the financial levers at their disposal to actually make it happen. I think, interestingly, the actual nuts and bolts of changing curriculum is not complicated. You take the offensive material, and we've mapped it out, we've documented it, we know exactly where it is, and you replace it with something else. And it doesn't have to, the textbooks themselves don't have to look different, they don't have to feel different. You can keep the same cover, you can keep some of the material, but just replace the harmful material with something else. So for example, I use the example in the presentation of Dalal Mughrabi, the female Palestinian terrorist. That's a genuine reading comprehension from an Arabic language textbook. Instead of holding a female terrorist as the role model for Palestinian girls, you could use somebody else. You could use, for example, there's a woman called Hindal Hussein, who after 1948, Palestinian woman, she sets up a number of orphanages for Palestinian children. That to me sounds like a much better Palestinian female role model. So quite simply replace one passage with another passage, which is still a passage that I guess promotes a Palestinian role model. It doesn't have to be something non-Palestinian. It shouldn't be something non-Palestinian. This is a Palestinian curriculum. But it can be something that is wholesome, it encourages tolerance and does not encourage hate and violence. The nuts and bolts really aren't very difficult. As I said, it's just a matter of will to make it happen.
So when it comes to Palestinian school books, Impact has been doing a fantastic job exposing the content, but I'm very skeptical about the ability to change that from the inside, because you brought the example of what's her name, Dalal Mughrabi. It's just part of who they are. Like, Palestinianism is an ideology. It's based on the rejection of Israel, and if they wouldn't reject Israel and they wouldn't call for the killing of the Jews, they would stop being Palestinian, which is an ideology. So it's basically, it's who they are. And as you said yourself, when they ask, you shouldn't be teaching that, they say, well, if we don't get money from Europe, we'll just take the money from somewhere else, because it's more important to them to teach this hatred than to actually get money from Europe. And so, yes, it is very important to expose the content and to show to European governments and hold them responsible, and you guys are doing a great job doing this. All I'm saying is that at the end of the day, it's the very essence of Palestinian ideology is the rejection of Israel and the glorification of the murder of Jews. Regarding US campuses, I think that there's a good start in the past 3 months of simply cutting funds to those universities. You can't, ask. It's like teenagers when they ask you to get out of their life, but they ask you for their pocket money at the end of the month. It's just the same thing with universities. If you want to teach your kids to hate America and Western civilization, don't go to the government asking for money to teach that. And I think that cutting the funds for this university is a good start. Not sending your kids to those places is another good idea, because why spend all this money to be brainwashed about all those insane ideologies?
Yes, we can take that one. This is for you, Emmanuel. Why are we not seeing moderate Muslim leaders in Europe following the lead of the UAE and Saudi Arabia in teaching more tolerant Islam?
Because when they do, they get killed. So there is one, for example, in France, is very famous, Imam Shargoumi, but his family lives in the UAE, and he lives under 24/7 protection from the police, and he has to sleep every evening in a different place. Why? Because all he says is that the Jews are not pigs and monkeys, and they're actually the cousins of the Muslims, and we have to have a dialogue with them. That's all he says, and we need to have peace with Israel. As a result, his family has to live in the UAE, and he has to live under permanent protection. So that answers your question. You talk about tolerance, you promote tolerance and peace, you get either killed or you threaten to be killed. So that actually, answers your question.
I have a follow-up for you. What about the government in the UK? I mean, you spoke about the reports that were covering the Muslim schools and the investigations, but it doesn't seem like anything has changed. Why is that? Why do you think there's not any accountability or reform?
Because the UK is already Islamicized. It's too late. When you have the princess, the heir to the throne a few months ago, after there was so-called some violence against Muslims, she went to meet the imam of a Muslim neighborhood in London. She came with a headscarf. The heir to the British throne and the imam refused to shake her hand, and she apologized for, giving her hand to this imam. So the UK is a lost cause. It's just, I'm sorry to say, it's just too late.
So Mary went to see a lady rabbi and he didn't want to shake her hand?
If you have a question, you can write it down on the card. It makes it a little bit easier.
Why avoid it?
I'm not avoiding it, but everybody is
I'm
writing their
saying
questions down
that
on
she's the
cards.
heir to the throne, and she came covered not to a mosque but to a neighborhood of London. Okay.
To what extent, this is again also for anybody who wants to answer, do you believe the mainstream media is contributing or amplifying what is being taught in these schools? And this is for any of these schools.
Well, beyond teachers assigning articles that align with their ideology from the mainstream media, it's a sort of the mainstream media nowadays, let's say the New York Times, etc., is also very, very influenced by this Marxist socialist ideology, and so they're inclined to sympathize with Palestinians who they see as underdogs, and they write stories about that, and it's just it has a snowball effect. It just aligns with the ideology. Teachers see this as the truth, and they assign articles that present Palestinians primarily as victims. They don't. It's both mainstream media and the teachers. It's just part of this whole oppressor ideology. And both mainstream media plays into it, and the teachers, the activist teachers play into this.
Can I have a follow-up on that, your remark? So if today the trend is underdogs, and we sympathize with the underdogs, why don't we speak as we are the underdogs? We are a small country, let's go back to what we were. We are a small country surrounded by jihadists. We are a small country which all the resolutions in the United Nations are directed against it. We are being bullied. You have an obsession against the Jews or against the Israelis. Why are you bullying us? Why do you have an obsession against Jews? We are only 15 million in the world. Stop bullying us. We need help from the media. Please don't bully us. We don't like it. We are in the corner.
We understand, and for now on, we'll only be taking questions for the index card, so that's fair for everybody in the audience.
It's been years coming. Jews are seen as white supremacists, as Jewish supremacists, and to undo that, they don't see them as victims. They see they don't see Jews as victims.
I get that.
Well, you can't just remake years and years of this ideology that's baked into the system. You can't just undo it like that.
Start with a small step.
Well,
okay, thank you. For Dan, what should education look like in Gaza on the day after?
What should it look? I mean, it should, I guess, kind of in a way that I described before. You don't have to reinvent things. You've got to kind of reinvent the curriculum itself, I guess. But you don't have to change it. It can be done in a way where it's kind of a seamless process. As I said, the nuts and bolts are not actually that difficult. You can almost do it in a way where Palestinian children, not that they wouldn't notice the difference, but it can be done in a gradual way. You change content that is problematic. You replace the offensive stuff with things that are still, I guess, in character. You can still have an Islamic education. You can still have a Palestinian education, as they do in Saudi Arabia, as they do in the Emirates. But it doesn't have to be an education that encourages hatred and encourages violence, etc. I said the nuts and bolts of it really are, there are printing houses. Each year the Palestinian curriculum is printed, there are new editions essentially the content stays the same, but you really replace just one page with a new page of text. And there are people, we know that are actually kind of working on this and are trying to, so when the appropriate moment comes, hopefully, they can actually make a difference and gradually change it. But it has to be an education, obviously, that, entirely rejects the idea of violence, entirely rejects the idea of hatred. It's something that it's not going to happen overnight, but it's something that has been done, as we've seen over the last 7-8 years in the region, and is eminently possible. But in short, it's a curriculum not just for Gaza, but we'd like to see a curriculum throughout, Palestinian society that is different from what it is today, and simply one that encourages tolerance, encourages respect for the other, and rejects violence and hatred.
Thank you. I think this is a good question to end on for the evening. Now that we've unpacked how these harmful material is getting into our schools and seen the pushback can work in other countries and the US and so on, hopefully in Europe eventually, and what's one key takeaway that you can take a moment to share with everyone here, how the public, especially parents, concerned community members, can realistically play in challenging and changing these deeply entrenched issues?
Well, I think that the issue is to push back against these false narratives and to confront, first of all, to identify who's behind it and what's the message, and to expose, what the motive is and who's behind it and what they're saying, the lies behind it, and push back against it. And at least we see it with this administration. They're defunding, they're sending the ringleaders of the line with Hamas, they're deporting them, and they're defunding schools of higher education. That's a good start in the, as I said, K-12 education. This is for America. That's under the states and the local districts. And for that, we go to the task forces and the superintendents and the people who are in charge of curriculum, and we identify it. And it's just a matter of pushing back and making sure that education is honest and presents things accurately, and that there's no agenda behind it.
I think there's one takeaway, one practical takeaway to try and change the situation as it appears to Palestinian education. Change will come from the outside, it's not going to come from within the Palestinian Authority, and I think therefore anybody who's a citizen of another country, whether that be the US, whether that be the UK, countries that actually could help to catalyse some sort of change, who are funding the Palestinian Authority, who are funding UNRWA as well, who also have a huge role in Palestinian education. I think anybody who wants to make a difference, try to raise awareness with those that make decisions, whether that's the US, whether that's the UK, whether that's France, Germany, wherever you are from. If you have a say, if you still pay taxes in particular, know where your tax money is going, because this is partly where it's going. And if each and every person, I think, can raise that awareness amongst the people that can actually make a difference, because as I said, the difference will be from the outside. It's not going to be, certainly at this point in time, from within. That's the takeaway. That's, I think, what each and every person can do here.
So my recommendations to academics and to journalists, and you were mentioning before the ideology of the New York Times. I don't think it's ideology, it's the lack of courage, because you don't advance in your profession if you don't toe the party line. And they also get a lot of money on those media from Qatar. It's less ideology than opportunism. And I always say to journalists and to academics around the world in the West, you have to be willing to pay a price for moral clarity and courage, which means that if you don't get invited to conferences, you have to be ready for it. In fact, as Groucho Marx said, I wouldn't want to be part of a club that's willing to accept me. So if you get invited to a conference to Columbia University, ask yourself where you've been wrong. And I said this in my presentation, it's not enough to, and also to relate to the gentleman's question before, to go to the World Opinion and say, we poor Jews, they hate us, and the Qataris give money and to universities. We have to explain, and that is the truth to Western audiences. We are on the same side. We have a common enemy. Yes, they're after us, but they're also after you. So, the reason why you have this alliance between radical Islam and the far left in Europe and America, even though they have nothing in common, but they have a common cause, a common enemy, which is to undermine Western civilization. And that's why they see Israel as their enemy number one, because Israel is A, one of the pillars of Western civilization, and B, Israel is really fighting them. So you have to go to them and say, yes, they're after us in Israel, they're demonizing us, they're lying, they're defaming us, colonialists, whatever, all this nonsense. But they also go to you, they're also buying your professors with Qatari money, they're also presenting your civilization as a source of evil. And we have to fight together because we have a common enemy. And there are more and more people in Europe and in America who realize this and who are open to this argument, and we have to make it.
Thank you so much. I want to give a round of applause to our panelists. And I want to thank you all for coming. It's a very difficult topic, and it's obviously a little bit depressing, but it's also very, I would actually say, optimistic, because we've wasted, unfortunately, too many generations of children have gone through this indoctrination, and we haven't stepped up sooner, but people are stepping up. We are seeing change in the Middle East. We're seeing change in the West, even though it's there. We're doing something to address it, to stop it from furthering expanding. And the more that more people know about it and are aware of it and help us expose and combat it, the more likely that we'll be able to defeat it. So thank you so much for coming. Paul, let me say a few words.
I just want to thank everyone also for coming, and to thank Ricky Hollander, Dan Kosky, Manuel Navon, and Aviva Rosenstein very much for the evening. We have an event here in a few weeks,